The afternoon drifted slowly through the heart of the city, where the tall buildings reflected pale golden light like a layer of worn paint. Emily sat behind the wheel, her hands occasionally tightening on the steering wheel, her eyes following the line of cars gliding past dusty sidewalks. Beside her, Jake leaned his head against the window, listening to familiar tunes on the radio, his fingers absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone. Neither of them spoke, but the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like an end-of-day reward, simple and peaceful. As they turned onto a quieter street where ancient trees intertwined to form a soft green canopy, Emily instinctively slowed down. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, tinting the street with a faint orange light that softened everything it touched. The early autumn breeze wafted through the car's slightly cracked rear window. And then, in that very moment, as if the world had been yanked violently into a moment of panic, a blurry shape darted in from the roadside, so fast the eye couldn't even register it. The first jolt was the sound of sudden braking, and Jake's surprised shout, "What the hell was that?" Emily slammed the brakes, her heart leaping as she glanced at the rearview mirror. The rear window had been pushed wide open, and then they saw it. A German shepherd, skin and bones, its rough, dust-caked fur standing on end, its legs trembling, was curled into the back seat corner. Every muscle in its body seemed frozen by fear. What was once likely a smooth coat was now tangled, matted in patches. Its deep brown eyes were wide, wet like a lake disturbed by a violent wind, and they weren't looking out the window. They were looking straight at them. Jake turned fully around, squinting. "Did it jump into the car?" Emily didn't answer. She was staring into those eyes, not the eyes of a wild animal, but the eyes of a living soul thrashing in a nightmare it didn't understand why it couldn't wake from. She saw a storm collapsing inside that trembling body, a primal fear that needed no words. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't try to escape. It shrank, pressing itself tightly into the edge of the seat, as if trying to disappear, as if every inch it took up was an apology. Its tail was tucked, ears flattened, its entire posture like a soul just torn apart. Emily swallowed hard. She could feel her hands shaking, not from fear, but from the rush of too many things happening at once, and her heart couldn't organize them fast enough. A quiet question rose in her mind, not loud, but ringing clearly in the thick air of the car. Why did he choose us? It wasn't a question looking for logic. It was a realization that this dog didn't choose by chance. He didn't jump into just any car, didn't dash into a restaurant or crawl beneath a table. He chose a car slowing down beneath the evening sun. He chose them. Jake leaned forward, about to open the door and step out, but the moment his hand touched the door handle, the dog flinched slightly, and a faint whimper escaped, not from pain, but as a pure reflex of terror. Jake froze, his gaze softening. No growl, no bark, no flash of teeth, just fear, a fear thick as darkness. "Jake," Emily whispered, her hand still resting gently on the wheel, eyes locked on the dog. "He's hiding, not from hunger, not from the cold, but from something much scarier." Jake nodded slightly. No one spoke again. At that moment, the car fell completely silent. The radio still played, but it sounded distant now, misplaced. Only the dog's breathing could be heard. Short, rapid, irregular, like the heartbeat of someone just pulled back from the edge. Emily slowly turned again, and her eyes met his one more time. No longer as panicked as before, but now filled with a silent plea, as if asking, "If I trust this time, will it be the last time I'm betrayed?" And Emily, for reasons she didn't fully understand, could only respond with one thing. She couldn't leave him behind. Not after seeing the pain in his eyes, not after hearing those jagged breaths like cracks splitting through his chest, not when he had chosen them in a world that had already turned its back on him. All three of them remained still in the car, bathed in the fading twilight. Emily kept her eyes on Tyson, as if the moment she looked away, he would vanish from this reality, like the ghost of something that once existed but had been discarded by the world. He remained curled up in the back seat, silent, only his fragile chest rising and falling with those irregular breaths, as if he was carrying a fear far too heavy for his gaunt body. Jake let out a deep breath and turned to Emily, his voice low but firm. "We can't keep him. You know that, right?" She didn't respond. At that moment, there were no words strong enough to justify why they should keep a trembling, stray, possibly dangerous dog in their car. No reasoning made sense. There were only those eyes, the kind that made you feel like you were being truly seen. Jake exhaled again, glancing back where Tyson hadn't moved an inch. "I'll open the door," he said. "He'll go." He reached for the car door handle slowly, carefully avoiding any loud noises. But just as he turned, a slight movement stopped them cold. Tyson lifted his head. Slowly, very slowly, he turned to look at Jake. It wasn't the wary stare of earlier, or even the terrified one from when he'd first jumped in. It was a look weighed down, not crying, not begging, just so profoundly real that it made pretending impossible. That look said, "If I leave now, I won't survive the night. But I understand. If you can't keep me." Jake froze. His hand stayed on the door, but sweat was pooling in his palm. "Emily, we don't know if he's sick, or if he's aggressive. Remember the stray cat last time?" He didn't continue, but the concern in his eyes was clear. He was trying to be rational. Emily nodded slightly. She understood that fear, just like any adult trying to hold the world together with logic. But in this moment, logic couldn't face that gaze. That shrinking posture trying to make itself invisible. That trembling grew more intense each time someone pulled away. "Jake," she said, her voice so soft it barely broke the heavy air. "I don't know where he came from, or what scared him enough to jump into a stranger's car." She slowly turned to look at her husband. "But if we open that door and send him away, can I live with that decision?" Jake stayed silent. That wasn't a question to debate. It was a mirror held up to the gentlest part of themselves, where reason couldn't fill the void. A breeze slipped in, carrying the faint smell of distant smoke from a late afternoon somewhere, mingled with the dusty scent of Tyson's matted fur. He didn't move, as if trying to minimize his existence. A habit formed in places where no one teaches love. Jake turned back, no longer avoiding eye contact. For the first time, he didn't just see a stray animal, but a soul left behind. Maybe someone raised him and abandoned him. Maybe he escaped from somewhere. He paused, his voice dropping. "But why our car?" Emily turned and met his gaze. For the second time, the question echoed, this time from both of them. Why did he choose us? No one had an answer. But in that silence, a decision took root. Not because they knew what the right thing was, but because they simply couldn't turn away. Not when a being like Tyson had placed his last bit of hope into this very moment. Emily tightened her grip on the wheel, shifted gears, and the car began to move again. Tyson didn't stir, but if you looked closely, his ears twitched, just barely. For the first time since he jumped into the car, it wasn't because of fear, but because he was listening. He didn't know where he was going, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a place to run from anymore. Maybe it was a place to begin again. The car drifted quietly toward the outskirts as the sun began to disappear behind rows of rooftops. Emily kept her hands on the wheel, her eyes occasionally flicking up to the rearview mirror, where since the moment the engine started, the image of the emaciated German shepherd had remained still in the backseat corner, unchanged. Tyson didn't stir. He didn't whimper, nor react in any way, even when the uneven road caused the car to jolt gently. It was as if he had been frozen by something no one in the car could reach. A fear so deeply ingrained that it no longer had a clear shape, only complete paralysis. Jake glanced at Emily from time to time, then looked out the window, saying nothing. Neither of them felt the need for words right now. Tyson's presence in the car was already so full, so heavy, that it filled every silence. Not with noise, but with a stillness so dense that every ticking of the dashboard clock seemed to echo through their chests. Emily kept watching Tyson in the mirror. In the fading light, his matted fur looked almost gray, making his already thin body appear even smaller. His chest rose and fell ever so slightly, short and even breaths, like he was trying not to disturb anyone, as if his very existence was a burden that needed to be folded up, hidden away, never drawing attention. She looked into those deep brown eyes, the only part of him not swallowed by stillness. But the light in them didn't reflect anyone in the car. It wasn't searching for presence, familiarity, or escape. Those eyes were looking inward, as if he had locked himself inside, replaying a film only he could see. They weren't the eyes of a stray dog. They were the eyes of someone who had lost so much, for so long, they no longer knew how to react to kindness. Once, when the car stopped at a red light, Emily gently turned her head for a clearer look. Tyson was still there, his eyes fixed on the void. But this time she noticed his pupils weren't trembling anymore. They were still, heartbreakingly still, as if he wasn't afraid of what might come anymore. Because once the worst has already happened, you stop trembling. You just wait. The light turned green. The car rolled on. Cool air slipped in through the cracked window, carrying the scent of late summer twilight. Faint, earthy, distant, like a memory folded up and stored away long ago. Jake murmured, "He still hasn't moved." Emily nodded slightly. Her voice was so quiet it seemed to melt into the wind. "He doesn't need to move. He just needs to be left alone long enough to believe that, just this once, no one's going to make him run anymore." No one replied. The air in the car remained still, but the tension had softened, like a sorrowful melody slowly finding its rhythm again after too many offbeat silences as they turned onto the rural road leading home, lined with tree shadows, the last light of the sun slipping through the leaves like golden streaks laid sideways. Tyson suddenly turned his head toward the window. Not fast, not decisive, just a slow, instinctive movement, as if some part of him wanted to check if the outside world was still dangerous. His brown eyes touched the sky, now deepening into indigo. A single star had just blinked into view, faint and alone. Emily glanced at the mirror again, and this time she met his eyes, no longer wild with panic, but still distant, as if caught between two worlds, the one that had abandoned him and the one where he didn't yet know if he belonged. It was a look without words, but if it could speak, perhaps it would whisper, "Please don't send me away." And so they kept driving, through the last light of the day fading like the warmth left over from a long afternoon. The car glided between two kinds of quiet, one of doubt and one of something so fragile people often call it hope. Tyson didn't know where he was being taken, but for the first time in many months, perhaps he wasn't thinking about how to escape. By the time the car came to a full stop in the driveway, night had truly fallen. The last trace of twilight was a thin smudge of dark indigo on the horizon, fading behind the trees. The autumn breeze rustled through dry leaves and slipped into the narrow space between the car and the old wooden porch, bringing with it a chill that was soft, even soothing, like an exhale after a long, tired day. Emily turned off the engine, her hand still resting loosely on the wheel. They were home, a place she had always called peace, though she had never tested whether it could hold a soul that had been so thoroughly broken. Tyson remained curled in the same spot, pressed into the backseat corner. He didn't budge, not even a twitch. His gaze no longer pointed toward anyone, or out the window. It had pulled deep inside, fixed on some private screen of memory no one else could see. "Can we bring him in?" Jake asked softly from outside, one hand holding the grocery bag, the other waiting by the door. Emily didn't respond right away. She opened the back door, the creak of the hinge slicing through the cautious silence. She crouched down, as if approaching an open wound, and gently placed a piece of cold chicken in front of Tyson. leftover from lunch. He smelled it. His nose twitched slightly, but he didn't move forward, didn't stretch. It was as if he was still caught between hunger and the instinct to protect himself. An instinct sharpened by so many repetitions of fear, it had become muscle memory. Emily quietly pulled a light blanket from the front seat, then slowly, gently, slid her hand beneath his body. She didn't rush. She didn't speak. She simply let her warmth seep through the threads of the fabric. As the blanket wrapped around his frail form, she could feel every shallow breath, every tense muscle, like a bow pulled to its limit without a string. "You're lighter than I thought," she whispered, almost to herself, her voice breaking into her palm. Tyson didn't respond, but he didn't resist either. He let her lift him, his body limp, not from surrender but from sheer depletion, like a crumpled piece of paper, thin enough to tear at the lightest touch. She stepped over the threshold, Jake silently making way. The warm yellow light from the ceiling spilled over the rug, casting a soft glow in the corner of the living room. Emily laid Tyson down beside the fireplace, long since extinguished, a spot once favored by an old cat they'd lost years ago. She pulled the blanket gently over his back, then stepped back a few feet. Not too close, not too far, just enough so he wouldn't feel pressured, but close enough to be there if he needed comfort. Tyson didn't move. He curled tighter, tail tucked against his belly, body trembling so subtly it was barely noticeable unless you were truly looking. His eyes were still open, so wide you had to wonder if he ever closed them at all. Not from alertness, but from fear that closing them might mean waking up somewhere else, somewhere with no blanket gently placed, no bowl of water beside him. Jake stepped forward, set down the water bowl and some dry food next to the blanket, then dropped onto the couch with a sigh that no one could quite tell was relief or worry. The room sank into a strange kind of quiet, not completely silent, but far from noisy. Every small sound, the click of the clock on the wall, the breeze tapping the window pane, seemed unusually sharp, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something from that fragile creature. Through the window, the neighbor's house flickered with light. And there, standing still like a statue, was a small figure in the window frame. Leo, the 9-year-old boy next door, messy brown hair, oversized white t-shirt, stood motionless, eyes fixed on the room where Tyson lay. His gaze didn't hold the simple curiosity of a child. It carried something deeper, more solemn, as if Leo saw something in Tyson the adults had missed. Emily met his eyes through the glass. She nodded once. No wave, no gesture. She understood. Some connections need no words. Leo looked at Tyson the same way Emily had looked at him the first time, as if knowing something fragile had just been placed into the world, and everyone was afraid of dropping it. Inside, Tyson still didn't move. His eyes remained wide open. The water bowl is untouched. The food is still full. But in that corner of the rug, something had shifted. The silence was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of waiting, waiting to see if someone would truly stay this time, waiting to see if his existence no longer had to be something hidden. And Emily, still sitting there, eyes never leaving him, quietly told herself, "No one should live folded in on themselves like that. No dog deserves to become the shadow of their soul." She didn't push him to eat, didn't move closer. She simply stayed, like a small light in the night. Not blinding, but just enough to let the lost know they were no longer alone. The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight pierced through the curtain and cast slender lines across the wooden floor, Tyson was still in his spot by the fireplace. He hadn't slept all night, or perhaps he had dozed off for moments, light and shallow, like a soldier resting in a trench, where even the slightest sound could be the herald of something terrible. Emily stepped softly out of the kitchen, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. She didn't approach him right away, simply sat quietly on the edge of the couch, her eyes fixed on that small figure still curled tightly in the thin blanket. Tyson didn't look at her, didn't react. But the fact that he was still there, not running, not trying to escape, was already something fragile, something worthy of reverence. When she stepped outside to breathe in the morning air, she saw Leo. The boy was sitting on the front steps of the porch, back resting against a wooden column, a small sketchbook in hand. His tousled brown hair fell over one eye, and a stubby pencil twirled slowly in his fingers. There was no sound, no greeting. But with just a glance, Emily knew Leo had been sitting there for a while, perhaps even before the sun had risen above the roof tiles. Leo had selective mutism, not an inability to speak, but an inability to make himself speak in everyday situations. He chose silence as a defense mechanism, a way to shrink from a world that was too bright, too loud. He rarely interacted with others, didn't respond when teased, or even when his name was called. But with Tyson, it was different. Every day, as sunlight began to spill into the living room, Leo appeared. He didn't step inside, didn't ask questions. He simply sat there, right at the threshold, like a gentle breeze brushing the edge of the house and choosing not to stir anything. He drew Tyson. At first, the sketches were simple. Upright ears, wide eyes, a tail curled like a question mark. Then, day by day, the details became sharper. The tangled fur, the protruding ribs, the ever-open eyes that didn't see. Leo sat for hours, silently, diligently, not to display the drawings, but as if trying to understand something the adults had missed. Each morning, he would also quietly place a cookie outside the door. Sometimes gingerbread, sometimes butter cookies his mother baked. Not as bait, not as a treat. Just a gentle sign. I was here, and I see you. Tyson, as usual, didn't touch the cookie. But he didn't turn away either. That was the first thing Emily noticed. The dog who once trembled at the sound of approaching footsteps, who had pressed himself against walls as if scared even of the noise his own shadow might make, could now lie there, not eating, not barking, but also not rejecting the presence of this small boy. On days when light rain fell, Leo still came, his jacket zipped up to the neck, his pencil speckled with droplets. Tyson watched him through the window, didn't blink, didn't look away, as if two souls who had never learned how to name their pain had recognized each other without a word. Jake noticed once, when he stepped outside, about to tell Leo, "Come in before you get soaked," only to see Tyson suddenly turn his head. That first intentional glance directed at someone else. It made Jake pause. Not out of fear, but because he realized that the boy outside and the dog inside were holding on to something. A thread, delicate, yet no one had the right to interrupt it. And from that day on, no one stopped Leo. No one asked what he was doing or why he sat there every day. They let him draw, let him leave his cookies, let him be present as part of a healing process no one had taught, but somehow he understood. Tyson remained much the same. He didn't eat, didn't bark, didn't come close to anyone. But his blinking slowed, his breathing lengthened a bit, and his tail was no longer curled so tightly it seemed locked in place. Emily began to believe, tentatively but with hope, that perhaps Tyson didn't just see Leo. Perhaps, on a deeper level, he felt him. Felt the silence that wasn't indifference, but the silence of someone who had once been too scared to say what they truly meant. And in that silence, something strange was happening. Bit by bit, there were no sudden barks, no wagging tail yet. But something was shifting, like the first snowflake of the season landing on a warm palm, melting slowly, leaving behind a sensation both unfamiliar and known. A thread was forming, not through voice, not through threats, but through patience, and the quiet act of simply showing up, each day, just enough, until even fear grew tired and let go. As night fully blanketed the small town, Emily and Jake's quiet home faded into gentle darkness. Leo had gone home early, the opposite window closed, and only the warm glow of a night lamp lit the living room where Tyson still lay on the old rug near the fireplace. Emily had wrapped him in a blanket, gently smoothed out a crease, then quietly withdrew to the bedroom, promising herself she'd check again shortly. The daylight hours had worn down some of the sharp edges in the dog's mind, and Tyson seemed quieter. Not less afraid, but at least no longer poised to bolt at every small sound. Emily knew, for creatures like him, every step forward, no matter how small, was worthy of silent gratitude. But she didn't yet know that Tyson's true fear didn't live in the daylight. It lived in the dark, and when night became truly still, that fear rose out of its hiding place. Around 3 a.m., a howl burst through the silence. Not long, not frantic, just a dry, sudden sound, lodged in his throat, as if it had broken free from terror that had been held in too long. Emily sat up instantly. She jumped out of bed and hurried down the dark hallway, her heart pounding, and before she even turned on the light, she saw it. In the dim glow filtering through the streetlight outside, Tyson was howling silently. He writhed and slammed into the glass door, his bony frame crashing to the floor, paws clawing at the air, eyes wide with panic. Emily froze for a split second. Then she ran to him, dropping to her knees, her voice breaking beyond her control. "Tyson! It's okay. You're okay now." He didn't hear her. Or rather, he was trapped in an invisible space she couldn't enter to pull him out. A different world, dark and violent, was wrapping its chains around his soul. At that moment, images flashed through Tyson's mind, fast, disjointed, but sharp as blades. A flashlight glared into his eyes. Shouts, chaotic and close, dogs barking like alarms, a human hand falling, a painful roar, he didn't know whose. The smell of smoke, the smell of blood, the scent of panic, and then blackness. Emily grabbed the soft fleece blanket and wrapped it around Tyson like a child pulled from a nightmare. He kept thrashing for a moment, paws kicking the floor as if fighting off an invisible attacker. But as the blanket tightened, as her breath neared his ear, something began to crumble. He started to tremble, not from resistance, but from fear. Fear so deep it made his body go limp. "It's okay now, Tyson. No one's going to hurt you. You're home now," Emily whispered, over and over like a spell. She didn't know if he understood the words, but he was listening. Or at least, he felt the voice held no danger. After a few minutes, Tyson began to settle. Only the sharp, ragged breaths remained, a line of saliva trailing from his mouth, and his eyes locked on a blurry spot outside the window. As if the darkness still had something left to say, Jake rushed in from the bedroom, sleep still clinging to his face. But when he saw the scene, he froze. Tyson lay curled in Emily's arms, hind legs still twitching slightly, as if trying to kick something away. No one spoke. The scene didn't need an explanation. It was a silent earthquake only those who had known trauma could understand. Emily gently stroked Tyson's neck. Just once. Very slowly. "We're here now," she whispered. "No one's leaving you again." Tyson didn't look at her, but his breathing began to slow, and in the dim light spilling from the street lamp, a single tear, barely visible, slid down the clumped fur on his cheek. Not from hunger or pain, but from memory, from loss, and from the fear that believing again might hurt even more. Jake quietly fetched a warm blanket and laid it out near the fireplace. Neither of them spoke again. Tyson gradually calmed, his gaze distant, but no longer spasming. Emily remained beside him, one hand resting on his back like someone gently holding a branch on the verge of breaking. As Tyson began to breathe evenly again, eyes half closed but not quite asleep, Emily looked up at the ceiling, unable to shake what she had seen in his eyes when the panic struck. Images are unclear, but too real to be dreams. Something terrible had happened. Not just hunger, not abandonment, a profound loss, someone once deeply important, an event that shattered his sense of safety, and perhaps it still lingered, unfinished, somewhere inside him. Tyson drifted into a tired sleep, not deep. But for the first time, his body lay flat, no longer curled up in defense. The trembling remained, but perhaps now it was only the echo of fear, no longer a cry for rescue. And in the darkened room, with only a small nightlight casting a faint glow against the wooden wall, Emily sat beside him like a small candle, keeping watch over a sleep he had never dared to have. The next morning, sunlight filtered quietly through the thin curtain, spreading across the floor like a layer of gentle honey. Tyson still lay beside the fireplace, his head resting on the edge of the rug, eyes half closed, his tail tucked close to his body in that familiar defensive posture. He no longer trembled as much as the night before, but his breath remained slightly quick, not out of fear exactly, but as if he had learned to live with tension as an inseparable part of himself. Emily sat nearby, her hand resting gently on Tyson's back, not stroking, just resting there, as if to say, "I'm here." She was still haunted by the memory of last night's panic. The look in his eyes wasn't that of an animal, but of a soldier fallen under the weight of a flood of memories. Jake walked in from the kitchen, coffee in hand, his voice low as if carrying a decision. "I think we should take him to Walter." Emily nodded slightly. No further explanation was needed. Walter lived on the edge of town, a small pinewood house with a rusted tin roof, surrounded by old maple trees and the distant cawing of crows. He had once been a combat medic, serving in a special forces unit, then discharged after a blast injury to his leg. Since then, he lived with a blind cat named Marley and ran a tiny vet clinic for those with enough patience to find him. Jake carried Tyson to the car, still wrapped in the familiar blanket. Tyson didn't resist, didn't react. But as the car began to move, he opened his eyes just slightly. For the first time since arriving home, his gaze wasn't empty. It was fleeting, like a breeze gliding across a still lake. Walter greeted them with his usual austere presence. Rolled-up sleeves, thick glasses, white hair sticking up like owl feathers. He wasn't tall, but his voice was deep and firm, each word seeming to have walked through a battlefield and returned whole. When Jake brought Tyson into the tiny clinic, Walter didn't greet them right away. He stood silently, observing, and after only a few seconds, he spoke, almost to himself. "The way he keeps his head low but scans every direction. That's not fear, that's training." Jake froze. Walter crouched, keeping his distance, eyes fixed on Tyson as if reading every fold in his tangled fur. He didn't rush, just sat there, took off his watch, and set it aside on a nearby table. A small gesture, but one that animals once abused recognize. "I carry no threat." Tyson glanced at him. No growling, but his eyes were taut like a pulled string. All four legs tucked tightly beneath him, but he didn't retreat. "Just as I thought," Walter murmured. "He used to serve." Jake swallowed hard. "How do you know?" Walter pointed to Tyson's shoulder. "See that worn patch near the scapula? Small calluses. That's from a harness. Standard issue, not the kind for pets." He paused, his gaze softening, then added, like a wisp of smoke rising from memory. He wasn't trained to love anyone. He was trained to obey. Walter took out a small scanner and swept it along Tyson's neck. A soft beep sounded, but the screen stayed blank. "Disabled," he exhaled. "Someone didn't want him to be found." Jake clenched his hand. "So, he was abandoned?" Walter didn't answer right away. He walked over, opened a drawer, pulled out an old file folder, flipped through a few pages, and set it on the table. "Some dogs don't get to retire. They get replaced. When a handler is injured or killed, and the unit no longer has use for them, they're reclassified. Dogs can't file appeals, can't speak up, so they're sent away. If they're lucky, they go to a care facility. If not..." He looked deep into Tyson's eyes, which hadn't moved, still tense. "They're made to disappear." Emily stepped into the room then, quietly placing her hand on Jake's shoulder. She saw the look in Walter's eyes, the look of someone who'd grown used to loss, to wounds with no one left to hear about them. And now he was seeing a reflection of his younger self in this small, silent creature. Walter leaned forward and gently touched Tyson's paw. Tyson flinched, but didn't pull back. That was all Walter needed. He was a K9, trained, then forgotten. Jake's hands clenched tighter. His lips were pressed into a thin line. Emily said nothing, but her eyes filled with tears. Tyson didn't react much, but when Walter slowly ran his hand down Tyson's back, as though smoothing the memory of something long buried, Tyson exhaled a long, long breath. Not a whimper, not fear, just a breath, like a piece of a life finally being called by its name. By the time they left Walter's clinic, the sky had turned to late afternoon. No one said much on the drive home, not because of heaviness, but because each of them was holding a quiet space within themselves. Jake gripped the wheel, his eyes occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror, where Tyson lay silently in the back seat, still wrapped in the familiar blanket. Walter hadn't offered many diagnoses, but he had said one thing Emily couldn't shake from her thoughts. Some dogs, after being forgotten for too long, learn to live like shadows, not because they want to, but because it's the only way not to be hurt again. When they arrived home, the last light of day spilled through the front window, casting a pale gold across the carpet and sofa. The house remained as quiet as always. But now, the silence carried new meaning. A safe space and a challenge. "I think we should give him a bath," Jake said, setting the keys on the table. "He needs to feel clean, and he needs to know that touch doesn't always mean pain." Emily nodded. No hesitation, just a fragile awareness that every action now required all the patience their hearts could gather. They laid towels across the bathroom floor and prepared warm water, soft cloths, and a mild soap made for sensitive canine skin. Emily opened the bathroom door while Jake gently sat beside Tyson. He was still lying there, eyes open but showing no resistance. Jake didn't try to lift him. He just leaned down and whispered, maybe to himself more than anyone else, "No one's taking you away again. This is a place to stay." After a few minutes, they used the soft lead Walter had suggested, not to restrain, just to offer a small anchor, and slowly guided Tyson towards the bathroom. He walked slowly, each step dragging like he was wading through something old and thick. Only when the water began to run, reflecting the dim light and releasing gentle steam into the air, did Tyson pause. Emily knelt by the tub, her eyes never leaving his. "It's just water, Tyson," she whispered. "Water, and a little kindness. You can try to trust." She scooped a ladle of warm water and poured it gently over his back. Not a splash, just a silent greeting. For a moment his body jolted violently, muscles tightened, his front legs twitched, a reflex born from memories of being struck when wet. Jake tensed, hands ready to catch him if he bolted. But Tyson didn't run. He kept trembling but didn't growl, didn't howl. He simply stood there, like a statue eroded by fear. Then he let out a long, deep breath. So long that Emily felt like she'd just heard the first crack form in the sheet of ice covering him. Jake stepped closer, his hands now lathered with soap. He rubbed Tyson's neck, gently enough that it felt more like drawing than washing. No pressure, no rush. Emily continued pouring water, avoiding his ears and face. They didn't hurry. After a while, Jake sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, one hand resting on the edge of the tub. Tyson was now covered in white foam, his fur beginning to reveal its true color beneath the dirt. Soft yellow around his neck, deep brown down his back, with a few faint scars in between. And in that moment, no one spoke, no one signaled. Tyson slowly lowered his head. He took a tentative half-step forward, not to avoid the water, not in fear, but as if something had just slipped off the glacier inside him. He tilted his head slightly, sniffed Jake's hand, then gently nudged his nose against Jake's knee. A touch so faint it could have been missed. But to Jake and Emily, it was a silent explosion. Jake froze, not moving. He could feel the warmth of Tyson's damp nose, that quiet contact that seemed to say, "I don't fully trust yet, but I'm trying." Emily turned to him, her eyes brimming. She held her breath, afraid any sound might snap the thread that had just been tied. But Tyson didn't pull back. He stood still, head slightly lowered, eyes tilted, as if still measuring the distance between a soul that had once been betrayed and a pair of hands now ready to receive him. They washed him until the water ran clear, the foam dissolved, and his coat began to emerge. Soft gold, dark chestnut, marked here and there by healed-over memories. When Emily dried him with a thick towel, Tyson didn't tremble as much. When Jake wiped his hind legs, Tyson simply turned his head to look. And when they opened the bathroom door, Tyson stepped out on his own. No lifting, no coaxing. No one said it aloud, but they all knew that was the first touch between trust and fear, and Tyson had chosen to take a step forward. 2 days after that first touch during the bath, the atmosphere in Emily and Jake's home had shifted. Not dramatically, not brightly, but subtly, like a warm breeze seeping into the cracks of an old wall. Tyson remained quiet, still flinching slightly when someone moved too fast or when a door slammed a little too hard, but each time Emily approached, he no longer recoiled. Each time Jake reached out his hand, Tyson didn't look away, and on the second afternoon, he gently touched his nose to Emily's hand as she brought him a bowl of water. Not to ask, not to beg, but as a whisper, "I see you." Just as they were beginning to learn not to rush his healing, to let his pain set its own pace, far away on the edge of town, in an old house with sagging floorboards, the old Dr. Walter sat hunched over a wooden desk, eyes fixed on a computer screen he hadn't touched in weeks. Marley, the blind cat, was curled in his lap, eyes half closed, long since used to late nights with her owner sifting through forgotten files and buried traces. Walter was not one to give up on a suspicion. After touching Tyson, he had seen it clearly. Not just the physical signs, but in how the dog breathed, how he looked, how he kept himself just outside the borders of any connection. It wasn't fear born from instinct. It was a wound with memory. He began tracing back the disabled chip, not something that happens without deliberate interference. Using old system codes and military backdoors from over a decade ago, Walter carefully navigated through the layers of dusty encryption, and then a string of data appeared. K9, Tyson, assigned unit, Riverside Police Department, handler, Officer Mark Forrester, final operation, hostage rescue, Crest Hill Elementary School. Date, April 12th, 3 years ago. Walter paused. His eyes narrowed at the familiar name. Forrester, a young officer once praised as top of his tactical class, but Walter remembered him not for his record, but for how his story ended, the kind that makes veterans fall silent when mentioned. That day, Crest Hill Elementary had been taken over by an armed assailant. 32 children and 3 teachers were held hostage. Mark and Tyson were the first team on the scene. According to the brief, Mark had tried to distract the gunman, drawing attention so Tyson could circle and pull an injured girl to safety. But the gunman noticed. Gunshots rang out in an instant. Mark was hit just outside the classroom. According to reports, Tyson, despite being wounded in the leg, lunged forward, bit the assailant's arm, and gave the backup team enough time to storm in. 8 students were saved at that moment. But Mark didn't survive. The incident was honored, covered by the press. There was a ceremony, speeches were made. But after that, Tyson was never mentioned again. Walter entered more queries. No records from K9 post-service care. No documentation of transfer or adoption. No shelters in that time frame had received a dog matching Tyson's file. He had disappeared. In the system, Tyson hadn't existed beyond the day Mark fell. Walter sat still, hand resting on the mouse, eyes lingering on the final line of text. Tracking signal lost, 6 hours after operation. Reason? Unknown. He leaned back and exhaled slowly. The glow from the screen reflected off his deeply lined face, stirring memories that hadn't moved in years. He thought of Tyson's eyes. Not just the eyes of an abandoned dog, but of someone who had witnessed what no one should see, and then survived, quietly, as if survival itself was some kind of mistake. Walter placed his hand gently on Marley's head, murmuring to himself, "Some beings stand beside someone, fight with them, and are forgotten the moment that person is gone. Maybe he didn't disappear. Maybe the world just chose to forget him, and he knew what he had to do." After the lines of data Walter uncovered, something seemed to slow inside Emily and Jake's home. Not out of sorrow, but because they were all learning how to listen to Tyson's silence as a new language, one that deserved respect, not interruption or interpretation. Tyson still moved cautiously, still chose shadowy corners to rest, and had yet to ask for a pet or seek out touch. But in his gaze, especially when Emily called his name or Jake silently placed a bowl of water nearby, there was a flicker of something like embers. Not a blaze, but no longer cold ashes either. And more than anything, whenever Leo appeared, small-framed, always carrying that thick sketchbook with worn-out edges, Tyson didn't retreat. He would quietly watch from a distance, his eyes softening, his breath slowing, as though seeing something he'd once lost. That afternoon, the air was still. The sun gently bathed the yard in a warm gold through the trees, and Leo, as usual, sat on Emily's front steps, saying nothing, just drawing. His pencil moved steadily across the page, each stroke deliberate, though sometimes he paused, as if reaching back for something unclear, something not quite yet formed inside him. Tyson lay not far away, head resting on his front legs, eyes half-lidded, but his ears twitched slightly every time Leo's pencil stopped, as if he were listening, silently and sincerely. Footsteps echoed from the alleyway beside the house, followed by giggles, and then the voices of 3 boys from Leo's class, 2 of whom had once called him that weird mute kid whenever they saw him drawing alone after school. "Still drawing that dog?" One of them laughed, waving a school notebook mockingly. "Like it understands you or something." Another shoved his friend and added with a sneer, "Not like you can talk to it anyway. Your dog's mute, just like you." Leo bowed his head. His shoulders tensed slightly. He clutched the sketchbook to his chest, like it was the one thing anchoring him against the noise. He started to retreat when one of the boys stepped in his way, voice raised, more mocking now. "Run, freak!" Right then, Tyson stepped out from the shadows. Not with a snarl, not with a bark, not like a stray acting on instinct, but with deliberate purpose. Each step was calm and firm, as if every paw laid down drew a line that would not be crossed. He stood between Leo and the boys, not too close, not threatening, but his posture was clear enough to make them stop mid-sentence. Tyson's eyes locked on them, not with rage, but with quiet authority. The gaze of a guardian, a soldier defending the last sacred piece of his world. "That dog," one of the boys whispered, stepping back. "The way it's looking, it's creepy." No one waited for a response. In seconds, they turned and ran, footsteps retreating down the alley, fading with each breath of peace returning to the yard. Leo remained still. His hands still clutched the sketchbook, eyes wide as he stared at Tyson's back. Still unmoving, but with his head slightly tilted as if he were listening to the boys breathing behind him. And then, in a voice so small and hoarse it sounded like it had been trapped in his chest for years, Leo whispered, "Tyson." Just one word, a single sound. A name he had never spoken to anyone, not since the world got too loud and no one listened anymore. Tyson turned his head. His eyes, once filled with loss and guardedness, now carried a soft glimmer, like he knew that being called by his real name was the rarest kind of gift. He didn't wag his tail, didn't leap to lick Leo's face like ordinary dogs. He simply stood there, eye to eye, and lowered his head, just slightly, not as a gesture, but as acknowledgement. "I heard you. I accept." Leo stepped forward, slow and hesitant, as if still unsure if the miracle had truly happened. He didn't speak again, just gently laid his small hand on Tyson's shoulder. Not petting, not pulling, just a touch. But that single touch hushed the entire world, setting its attention on two souls who had just broken through a wall of silence that had stretched across half a childhood. Tyson didn't pull away. He stood steady, like the corner of trust that had just begun to take root. Emily, standing in the doorway still holding the dish towel from the kitchen, froze, saying nothing. Jake, out back with the garden hose still running, looked up through the trees. No one interfered, because they understood that some miracles only happen when grown-ups are quiet enough not to explain them away. Since that fateful afternoon, when Leo called Tyson by name, breaking years of silence, something wordless and sacred began to form between the boy and the dog. Emily didn't dare step too close. She only watched from afar, just enough to see how two deeply wounded souls were stitching each other back together in a language beyond words. Leo still came by every evening, sometimes with cookies, sometimes just his sketchbook. But now, instead of sitting a few steps away, he could rest right beside Tyson, even lean against him for hours, and Tyson wouldn't move. On the contrary, he seemed to have learned how to be still so someone else could find rest against him, just as Mark had once taught him during training sessions Emily would never fully know. But the cracks in a mind, the fragments of memory torn apart by trauma, don't vanish just because someone offers warmth, no matter how sincere. And then, on a night when the wind howled across the porch roof, it came back, without warning, like a wave yanking everything back to the beginning. It was just before midnight. The whole neighborhood was silent. Emily was folding laundry in the bedroom. Jake was dozing on the sofa, the TV long switched off, the room bathed in the dim glow of a nightlight. Tyson lay on his familiar rug, eyes closed, breath slow and steady, or so it seemed until the sharp wail of a police siren sliced through the quiet like a razor. Tyson bolted upright, no bark, no whimper, but his body stiffened, every limb locked like he'd been electrocuted, his ears pinned tight against his head, eyes wide and wild. In that instant, he wasn't in a warm room with soft rugs and gentle lights. He had been yanked into another world, of steel and blood and screaming chaos. Emily rushed from the bedroom the moment she heard paws hitting the floor. She saw Tyson backing into a corner, mouth open, breaths sharp and choking. Then a howl tore loose. Long, piercing, a cry that sounded like it was calling out to someone long gone. Jake startled awake, but before he could stand, Tyson had already slammed his head against the edge of a cabinet in a panic and collapsed onto the rug, thrashing, unreachable. His eyes no longer recognized anyone. They saw only ghosts. And in that broken, stuttering howl, the memories surged back, disjointed and brutal, like film reels shredded and stitched together with pain. A flashlight beam, blinding, cold, snapping his eyes shut. A voice screaming, "Mark, don't!" A gunshot, too close. Mark's body crumpled at the classroom door, one hand barely brushing Tyson's back in a final signal. A steel vehicle door slams, the stench of gas and sweat. A crate, small, cold, so tight he had to curl up just to breathe. Then came the first blow, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because someone needed to hurt something that couldn't fight back. Then the second, when he growled from pain. Then the third, when he learned that silence was safer than sound. All of it returned in mere seconds, and Tyson shattered, right there in the warm house he'd begun to trust, as if all the slow, careful rebuilding of the past few weeks had only been a paper shell stretched thin over unhealed wounds. Emily dropped to her knees beside him, arms outstretched but not touching, her voice trembling, gentle and pleading. "Tyson, you're home now. No one's locking you up. No one's going to hurt you anymore." Jake came closer, sitting low beside her, heartbreaking as he watched the dog who once protected a child now shake like something broken and small. And in Tyson's broken breathing, they heard what wasn't said. The loss wasn't just Mark. It was himself. The dog who once had a name, who once had someone to live for, now reduced to a shadow running from his memory. Emily slowly laid the corner of a blanket over him, her voice steady. "You can remember if you need to, but then let it go. We'll wait for you until you're ready to come back." And for the first time, in that dark room, Tyson didn't pull away. He lay down, not curled into a ball, but easing his head onto the rug, as if he could rest, just this once, knowing someone was keeping watch. The room dimmed, the sirens faded, and in the quiet that followed, there was only the sound of his breathing, uneven, imperfect, but real. After the night Tyson howled in terror, the house settled into a silence deeper than usual. Not heavy, but understanding. A kind of quiet that comes when you realize that the real pain doesn't lie in what you can still see, but in what someone has learned to bury just to survive. Emily didn't try to fix him. She didn't try to pull him out of the storm he'd just surfaced from. Instead, she simply continued what she always did. Each morning laying out the rug again, each afternoon placing water near his resting spot, and each night sitting beside him for a few silent minutes. Her presence became the steadiest rhythm in a fragile life, slowly relearning how to trust. But one question lingered in Emily's heart. Aside from her, Jake, and Leo, was there anyone else who remembered Tyson? Had anyone else ever known that he wasn't just a stray, wasn't just some dog, but a soldier, once named, once partnered, once devoted to something higher than instinct? So one afternoon, while Tyson lay curled beside Leo, who now whispered small words often enough to call him out of silence, Emily took a picture. In it, Tyson rested with his head on Leo's legs, not quite asleep, but no longer afraid. And Leo, arms wrapped around his sketchbook, leaned slightly against him, his face so calm it made the entire frame go still. She didn't use filters. No dramatic captions. She wrote simply, "He jumped into our car one quiet afternoon, shaking, terrified, covered in wounds. We didn't know who he was or where he came from, but then a little boy who hadn't spoken in 3 years called his name. And since that moment, they've both started to come alive again. If anyone out there knew Tyson, please say so. But if no one does, we'll stay with him until he chooses what he needs." Within an hour of sharing the post online, hundreds of likes appeared. People thanked her for her kindness. Some said the story made them cry. Then came a comment. Brief, no photo, but it made Emily freeze in the kitchen, her heart thudding wildly. "His name's not Tyson. I trained him. He's my dog. I'm coming to get him." Griggs. Emily didn't recognize the name. Jake was outside watering the garden. Tyson still lay sleeping beneath Leo's hand, twitching slightly at unfamiliar sounds, only to calm again under the boy's steady touch. She didn't reply right away. Instead, her fingers scrolled back to the top of her post, as if she too needed to remember what she had written. "If no one speaks up, we'll stay with him." But now, someone had spoken. Griggs, the man claimed Tyson as his own, said the dog belonged to him long before he chose them, that everything, Tyson's panic, his first nuzzle, Leo's whispered name, could all be temporary. Emily placed the phone on the table and sat down by the window. Outside, the light tilted golden across the porch, long and warm like an arm stretching out to hold something steady. Tyson still slept, his legs occasionally twitching in some soft dream. Leo breathed evenly, his small shoulders leaning against Tyson's back, an image of two souls slowly mending. And in that moment, the question returned, the one she had asked once before, now louder, urgent, and full of weight. Why did he choose us? Not another family, not a former handler, not any other car on the road that day. He jumped into theirs, on his own. No one pushed him. He stayed, not because they made him, but because he wanted to. Now, could someone who once lost him simply come back and claim him, just because the past had once been real? Emily didn't know, but she did know this. Some beings, once they choose where to heal, are no longer passing through. They are home. And if Griggs truly came, she would ask him that first. Not in anger, not with accusation, but with the same loyalty Tyson had once given someone without question. Were you truly there when he needed you most? The next morning, the sky was grayer than usual. Low clouds hung heavy over the rooftops like a silent warning. Emily woke early, her heartbeat irregular, as if sensing something about to unfold. And sure enough, just as she poured her second cup of coffee, the phone vibrated. A short message, not a word extra. "I'll be there at 9. Bring the documents." Sender: Griggs. Jake saw the message as he stepped in from the backyard. His gaze darkened slightly, but neither of them spoke. Tyson was lying by the window, head resting on his front paws, eyes following the slow drift of leaves on the porch, so calm he looked almost serene. But Emily knew he always sensed the slightest shift in the air. At exactly 9, Griggs arrived. The gray pickup truck pulled up in front of the house, coated in dust but not old, as if it had just driven in from another town. The man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, shirt buttoned to the collar, shoes polished to a shine, and in his hand, a folder secured in a plastic cover. He smiled, a perfectly polite smile. But there was something in his eyes that didn't linger, something that skimmed the surface and vanished. "Emily Carter?" he asked, shaking Jake's hand like a practiced gesture, then extended the folder, his voice firm. "I'm the one who trained Tyson. His real name is Thor. These are the training certificates and the transfer contract from his previous unit. He was a service dog I purchased after leaving the military." Emily took the folder, eyes scanning over faded stamps and smudged signatures. Everything looked right. Legal, verified, clearly dated. But something felt off, like a sour note in an otherwise harmonious song. Not wrong, but not fitting in. "You said you trained him?" Emily asked, voice still calm. "Then maybe you can tell us more about what Thor, was used for?" Griggs smiled slightly and shrugged. "Just the usual. Security checks, tracking support. Nothing special. He was a good dog, loyal, but a bit sensitive, easily triggered. That's probably why when the unit disbanded, no one else wanted to keep him." Jake's fist clenched, but he stayed silent. Tyson was still lying by the window, hadn't moved, hadn't barked. But what made Emily's skin crawl was the way he looked at Griggs. From the moment the man stepped onto the porch, Tyson's gaze shifted. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a clear recoil. He didn't charge. He didn't growl. But he let out a low, broken whine, not of anger, but a deep-seated fear, something etched into his memory. Then he backed away, rear paw bumping into a chair leg, retreating until his body pressed against the wall. He no longer looked at Griggs like someone familiar, but like a wound reopened. Emily stepped closer, gently placing a hand on his back, not to restrain, but simply to let him know she was there. Griggs noticed the reaction and frowned slightly, though he tried to maintain composure. He still seemed scared. Understandable. He had a few episodes after missions, but I was trained to handle that. The words seemed harmless enough, but to Emily, who had cradled Tyson in the middle of the night when he howled at passing sirens, who'd seen him tremble at the sound of slippers dragging across a floor, every word cut like a blade. "You said handle. What does that mean?" she asked, eyes still on Tyson. Griggs hesitated, then waved a hand and chuckled. "I just mean I know how to make him obey. He's a working dog. If they're not controlled, they're useless." And that, no shouting, no aggression, confirmed everything Emily had feared. Because Tyson wasn't useless. He'd simply stopped letting fear be the leash. Jake stepped up beside her, his gaze turning icy. Emily, in a strangely calm voice, set the folder on the table and said quietly, "We need more time to verify everything, and to ask Tyson." Griggs raised an eyebrow, his smile fading. "You're going to ask a dog?" "No," Emily replied, her hand still resting on Tyson's back. "I'm going to ask a soul who was betrayed and still chose to stay with us. She leaned down and whispered in his ear, "Tyson, if you don't want to go, just let us know." And in that moment, in a room filled with early noon light, in the shaky breath of a dog who had once lost even his name, Tyson didn't whine. He stretched gently, placed his paw on Emily's hand, then turned his head, not to look at Griggs, but to turn away completely. The answer was clear. From the moment Tyson turned his back on Griggs, no bark, no growl, just quiet refusal of an entire past, Emily knew things were far from over. Men like Griggs, the kind who wore smiles and carried papers like shields, rarely let go so easily. And sure enough, in the days that followed, her vague sense of dread began to take shape. At first it was only glimpses, a car parked far down the street, unmoving in the dusky gray light, engine off, no one stepping out. Another time, as Emily drew the curtains at twilight, she noticed a figure across the street, standing still, too far to see clearly, but close enough for her to feel the weight of a gaze fixed on their window. No direct threat, no movement closer, but that silence stretched taut like a wire ready to snap. Jake at first chalked it up to coincidence, a lost driver, a visitor waiting for someone. But when it happened for the third time in a week, he quietly installed 2 new outdoor cameras, hidden in hanging planters and at the fence's edge, feeding live footage straight to his phone. Emily didn't object. She knew what they were protecting wasn't just physical safety. It was the fragile peace Tyson had traded all his courage to find. But no one reacted more clearly than Tyson. From the day the first car showed up, a dark, gray, battered pickup with no front plate, Tyson never slept as soundly again. Whether by the fire or with his head on Leo's lap outside, he kept one ear toward the door, eyes never fully closed, as if relearning how to stand guard, not by command, but by choice. Every time the truck crept by, not stopping, just rolling slowly past, Tyson would rise instantly. No bark, no growl, just step up to the front door and stare through the glass, his body tense, as though bracing for something only his bones remembered. And if the truck lingered longer than a few minutes, he would start to growl, low, from deep in his throat, like a silent alarm only trauma could teach. Emily tried closing the curtain, but Tyson wouldn't let her. He nudged her hand with his snout, then stood firmly between the door and the family, eyes locked outside with a desperation not from fear of leaving, but from refusing to let anything enter. Even Leo noticed. He used to draw Tyson in soft, simple lines. But lately, his sketches began to include a figure, standing outside the window, face obscured, a black mass. And Tyson, always blocking the doorway, eyes fixed, tail low, fur raised at his neck. One evening, Emily found a drawing Leo had tucked under his pillow, a night scene with the fence, the gray truck parked outside, and Tyson's shadow inside the yard. His eyes had 2 small, pale circles, not light, but total alertness. Then one night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Emily woke to a soft sound, like someone stepping on gravel by the back fence. She crept downstairs, didn't turn on the lights, and cracked the kitchen window just enough to see out. And she saw it. The same gray truck parked less than 3 houses away. Its lights were off, but a faint glow flickered inside, like a phone screen. Her spine turned to ice, and just then, Tyson appeared beside her, silent, as if he'd been standing there all along. He looked at her, then turned to the door and let out a soft growl. Not panic, not fear. A warning. Emily shut the window quietly, her heart pounding. Not from fright, but from the dawning realization. They were being watched, and the person out there knew exactly who they were looking for. The next morning, Jake checked the cameras. The truck had appeared at least 3 times in the last 4 nights, always stopping in different spots around the house. Not quite enough to report, but more than enough to cause a deep unease. He said nothing to Leo, but Emily could tell, in how he locked the doors tighter, drew the curtains fully, and how his eyes scanned behind him whenever he entered a room. That night, Leo finished a drawing and quietly set it in front of Emily before walking away. In it, Tyson stood on the porch steps, head high, eyes fixed on the dark road. And behind him, on the familiar doorstep, were Emily, Jake, and Leo, sitting unaware. A shadow approached from the darkness. Below the drawing, Leo had written in a small, trembling hand, "He guards our sleep." And Emily understood. Tyson had once protected someone and lost them. Now, he had chosen to become the wall between the past and everything that remained to be saved. As the quiet signs began to form a distinct thread in Emily and Jake's minds, from the anonymous vehicle lingering at the edge of their street to Tyson's sharpened vigilance every nightfall, at an old house near the pine forest north of town, Walter was uncovering another truth, one that could explain why Tyson's fear ran so deep, and why his gaze shifted every time Griggs was mentioned. He sat in a cramped room, desk lamp casting a pale circle of light over a worn-out keyboard, fingers digging through files, fragments of data salvaged from an old hard drive he used during his years as a consultant for a volunteer K-9 association. Griggs had originally been nothing but a vague name, tied loosely to a few training sessions no one remembered. But the deeper Walter dug, the more the scattered dots began to connect, forming a picture he could only describe with one word: twisted. An internal document from 5 years ago, withdrawn just 3 weeks after its release, mentioned the existence of a tactical K-9 recovery center. The name sounded benevolent. But when Walter followed the funding trails and affiliate lists, Griggs's name popped up repeatedly. Lead trainer, independent sponsor, co-owner of facilities in a small western town. Walter kept going. Photos were scarce, most encrypted or scrubbed from public servers, but he managed to retrieve fragments of an unpublished report by an anonymous volunteer. It included 3 blurred images of steel cages lined up, and in one, a German shepherd, skeletally thin, snout scraped, eyes wide open in the dark. Beneath that photo, the caption read, "They aren't called by name. Just numbers. If they don't obey, head down, growl, freeze. They're punished." Griggs said, "They're tools, not pets." Walter's hand tightened around the mouse, his eyes drawn to the faint scar on the dog's cheek, exactly where Tyson bore a rough patch of bone under his skin. Walter had always assumed it was a campaign wound. He pulled up the scanned documents Emily had sent, those legal ownership papers Griggs had brought. The print, the stamps, everything looked legitimate. But Walter noticed a detail small enough to miss. A microchip ID listed on the documents had been permanently deactivated, not lost, intentionally erased. He called an old colleague who once worked in the official K-9 registry and asked about the code. The line went quiet for a few seconds. Then came a single sentence. "That's from a batch used for dogs removed from service. Psychologically damaged, no longer eligible. They're supposed to be retired or placed in verified foster homes, but Tyson was never officially received anywhere." Walter's chest sank. He pulled up an old photo of Tyson, back when he was still part of the K-9 unit, standing beside Officer Mark Forrester, ears alert, tongue out, eyes shining with life. Then he looked again at the photo from the recovery center. Same eyes, but now hollow and thick with darkness. A dog that once saved lives was dragged from the field after losing his handler, never honored, never named again, and turned into a subject of obedience testing through pain. Walter grabbed his phone and called Emily immediately. When she picked up, he didn't ease in. "You need to listen closely. This man, Griggs, he's not just trying to reclaim Tyson. He's trying to bury what Tyson remembers, and I have proof." On the other end, Emily fell silent. At that moment, she looked over at Tyson, sleeping now, breathing softly, body curled slightly as if still not fully convinced this night would be safe. And she understood. Tyson hadn't just run. He had survived. Walter's call ended in a heavy silence, and when Emily put the phone down, her hand still trembled from what had been revealed. Tyson, The being who had entered their lives wrapped in pure fear was now carrying a truth far greater than any of them had imagined. He was not just a victim of violence, but a living witness to a system that traded loyalty for control, obedience for pain, and memory for silence. She looked up and saw Tyson lying at Leo's feet, head gently pressed to the boy's thigh. No one had taught him to do that. No command was given. But ever since Leo first spoke his name, breaking a silence that had stretched over years, something had formed between them. Not a leash, but a shared rhythm. Something only those who've been left behind can recognize in one another. So when that night the rain came suddenly, heavy, cold drops hammering the porch roof like an urgent warning, Emily felt a hollowness echo in her chest. Leo wasn't in the house. He wasn't sitting on the porch steps like usual. And when she rushed next door to ask his mother, the panic in the woman's eyes confirmed the worst. We argued. He went quiet like always and closed the door. When I checked, he was gone. Emily didn't ask anything else. She turned and ran home, voice breaking as she shouted, "Jake! Leo's missing!" The rain pounded mercilessly. The clock neared 11 p.m. The streets were empty. Yellow light from the street lamps blurred under the sweeping water. Jake grabbed his coat and ran out with her, flashlights cutting jagged beams across puddles and rain-soaked pavement. But they had no direction until Tyson emerged. He didn't bark, didn't signal. He simply stepped out from the shadows, nose low to the ground, tail straight, eyes locked ahead. Emily saw it, an expression you couldn't name, but carried a laser focus, as if everything he had been trained for, everything he had endured and forgotten, had reawakened for one purpose. Leo was in danger. "He knows," Emily whispered, eyes wide. She turned to Jake. "Tyson is leading us." Without waiting, Tyson took off down the street, body slicing through the rain, soaked fur clinging to his lean but strong frame. Emily and Jake ran behind, flashlights chasing his shadow, through the town's edge, past sagging wet trees, into a forest path children were warned to avoid after dark. But Tyson never hesitated. He smelled it, not blood, not footprints, but the scent of someone he had chosen to bond with, a scent etched into his instincts and memory. He leaped over fallen trunks and bounded through puddles, only slowing when the scent grew thick. And there, he stopped. He turned back, eyes locking with Emily's, then lowered himself beside a dense tree base where flashlight beams just barely reached, and Jake saw him. Leo lay curled beneath the collapsed canopy, a heavy branch pinning his right leg. He was soaked, trembling, lips pale. He didn't cry, he didn't call, but his eyes were wide open, not in panic, but in a deep, aching sadness, laced with quiet relief at seeing Tyson's head dip beside him. Emily dropped to her knees, voice tight and cracking. "Leo, your mom's looking for you. Do you hear me? We're here. Tyson brought us." Leo didn't speak, but his small hand reached out, trembling, gripping the fur behind Tyson's ear, burying his face in it as if the whole world could be held in that warm, soft moment. Jake moved quickly, lifting the branch and checking his leg. "Not broken, maybe dislocated. We have to get him back fast." He scooped Leo into his arms, and Tyson stayed close, never more than inches from Jake's feet, as if he wasn't just guiding them out of the woods, but walking them back from the edge of a memory that had nearly swallowed a child whole. When the three returned to the porch, under the dim light spilling from the kitchen, Leo's mother stood there, crying, rushing forward to take him in her arms. But Leo didn't let go of Tyson. His hands still clung to the rain-soaked fur around the dog's neck, as if letting go would let the world slip away again. Tyson stood still. He didn't bark, didn't celebrate. He just looked at Emily with a steady, quiet gaze, and in that look, she understood. He didn't need thanks. He only needed to know he got there in time. And for a dog who was once called only by a number, beaten for disobedience, dragged into darkness, Choosing on his own to walk into the rain and bring back a lost child was the clearest truth of all. He was no longer a tool. He was part of a family, and no paper on earth could take that away. As the final raindrops fell over the muddy forest floor, Emily was still trembling, not from the cold, but from the image now seared into her memory. Tyson, the dog once labeled uncontrollable, was lying over Leo's small body, soaked, shivering, yet eyes wide open, watching every movement around them, as if ready to leap up and protect him at the slightest threat. It was Tyson who had led them into the woods, without hesitation, without command. And it was Tyson, by clawing into the soaked earth, tearing through tangled roots, who had found Leo buried under a fallen tree, trapped in slippery mud and hooked branches snagging his sleeves. While Emily and Jake still fumbled with shaky flashlights, Tyson had already lowered his head, sniffed the air, and let out a quiet whine. Not of fear, but of certainty. Here. Leo couldn't speak. His lips were pale, eyes half open in shock. He had no strength left to cry for help. But the moment he saw Tyson rushing toward him, his expression softened, as he knew then he hadn't been left behind. And while the adults struggled to lift the heavy branch from his leg, it was Tyson, without being told, who lay down beside Leo, pressing his body close like a living shield, against the wind, against the rain, against the loneliness that had haunted the boy for years. When the rescue team arrived, they thought their eyes were playing tricks. A German shepherd, unmoving in the mud, eyes wide, ears up, body draped over the child like he wouldn't let anyone near without permission. One rescuer stepped forward, and Tyson let out a low growl, not aggressive, not out of control, but a sharp, unmistakable warning. "He's under my protection." Only when Emily knelt and gently called his name did Tyson lift himself and step back, allowing the team to carry Leo to the stretcher. But even then, he walked beside them, step for step, eyes never leaving the boy, until they were both inside the ambulance. The moment was captured on a rescue team member's phone, not intentionally, but because it couldn't be left undocumented. A lone dog, rain-drenched, skinny, yet proud, walking like the commander of an entire operation. The photo was later posted online with a simple caption, "No words needed. He didn't leave, not through the rain, not through the cold. He saved a child." Within 24 hours, the post went viral. Local news stations started calling. Animal advocacy pages shared the story. People began speaking of Tyson not just as a loyal dog, but as a symbol of quiet healing, of a courage that had long been ignored. A talk show invited Emily to appear. She declined. "Tyson doesn't need a stage," she said. "He only needs to be with the ones he's chosen." But the story spread anyway, because some actions don't need microphones to echo. Back home, Leo returned after a night in the hospital, his leg in a light brace, but his spirit brighter than it had ever been. He no longer just whispered, "Tyson." He started speaking full sentences for the first time in nearly 4 years. When Emily brought him a glass of milk, he looked up and said softly, "Tyson wasn't scared of the rain. He stayed with me." And when Jake later found a new drawing, Tyson standing in the forest, head down, back shielding Leo from pouring rain, he simply nodded silently. The picture said everything. From that day on, those who had once called Tyson unclaimed fell silent. He didn't need a medal or a new collar. Tyson was a hero, not because anyone declared it, but because he stayed when others ran, because he chose to love and never asked for anything in return. As Tyson's story spread across the community, as hundreds of thousands on forums sent messages of admiration for the dog who lay still in the rain to protect a child, somewhere else, where sunlight rarely reached, Griggs made his move. No more lingering cars or shadowed eyes behind curtains. This time he took the most official, calculated route possible. Legal action. The letter from the court arrived in a stark white envelope, sealed in bright red, resting in Emily's hand on a gray morning just as she set down a bowl of water beside Tyson. He lifted his head as soon as she paused, his eyes not leaving her hand as she opened the paper, as if he could already sense something bad in the ink and the change in her breath. Jake stepped forward, read it quickly, and then clenched his fist. "Griggs, he's filing to reclaim lost property? He's calling Tyson property?" His voice caught in his throat, not just from anger, but from a deeper insult that struck something sacred neither of them had ever dared to name aloud. Tyson was no longer anyone's possession. He belonged to this family. Emily gently laid her hand on Jake's shoulder, as if anchoring something more fragile than truth. Reason. Then she looked down at Tyson, still lying between them, silent, unmoving, but his calm gaze reflecting every emotion they were trying not to show. He was no longer the dog who once cowered in the corner of a car seat. He now sat between two people fighting to keep him, not out of ownership, but out of love. Emily bent down, touching her forehead lightly to his, whispering words that didn't quite form sound, but made her lips tremble with helpless resolve. "You're not an object to be claimed. You're someone we chose, and you chose us too." Tyson blinked softly. His ears tilted back, not in fear but in a humble gesture, like he was saying, "I understand." The hearing was set for the following week. Jake wanted to protest immediately, but the lawyer they'd found, a woman named Clara, who once worked for an animal welfare organization, warned them calmly, "The court will consider both emotional and legal grounds, but every party has a right to speak. We can't dodge this." Emily nodded. But every night after that, she couldn't sleep deeply. Each time she woke in the dark, she'd find Tyson lying in the corner, head on the chair leg, eyes open, not dreaming, not resting, just waiting. And one night, when she reached out and touched his back, he gently leaned forward, nudged her palm with his nose, and lay back down. A small act, but one that felt like a vow. No matter what happens, he would not leave unless it was with the ones he now called family. Leo never asked about the summons. He never said he was scared. But one day, Emily saw a new drawing on his desk. Tyson stood in a doorway. Outside, a faceless shadow of a man waited. Inside were Emily, Jake, and Leo, each with arms reaching out. In the picture, Tyson had turned back, his gaze drawn inward. There were no words on the page, but Leo had written a single line in the corner, slanted and shaky. "We won't leave you behind, right?" Emily's tears fell beside that line, not from fear of losing Tyson, but because she knew. A boy who once said nothing had now learned how to trust with his whole heart. And Tyson, though he didn't speak, though he didn't write, was asking the same thing in silence every night as he lay between the two adults who had become his guardians, his walls, his home. "Will justice understand that I don't belong to anyone, only to the people I chose to stay with?" The town courthouse sat quietly at the end of a cobbled road, tucked beneath the fading gold canopy of old trees, witness to countless silent proceedings over the years, quiet divorces, land disputes, and today, something far more unusual. A dog would be at the heart of the debate, though his worth could never be measured in documents or legal clauses. Emily sat still in a row of pale wooden benches, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jake, despite doing his best to remain composed, couldn't hide the anger flashing in his eyes as he looked toward the man standing at the witness stand. Griggs, dressed in a crisply ironed shirt and a dull gray tie, recited his statement like it had been rehearsed to perfection. "Tyson, also known as Thor, is my legal property, trained to K9 operational standards. After the unit was disbanded, I accepted custody of him within the recovery center I manage. The animal's escape does not invalidate my ownership." His voice was steady, not loud, not nervous, but his gaze was cold and wooden as it flicked toward the opposite bench, where Tyson sat beside Jake's leg. No leash, no muzzle, yet still, utterly still, proud, as if knowing his very presence was the most powerful argument. Emily inhaled deeply. When her name was called, she stood and stepped to the front, the soft yellow light casting down across her shoulders. But her voice was firm, solid as a stone built from the days and nights she had lived beside Tyson. Tyson is not a lost object. He didn't escape. He ran from a place where cruelty was labeled training. From the first day he leaped into our car, he wasn't searching for ownership. He was surviving. She paused, her eyes misty but holding strong, then turned to glance at Tyson. Not to speak for him, but to echo what he had already proven through every action since. Then Walter, the old veterinarian, was called forward. Leaning on a cane, his sharp eyes steady behind thick glasses, he presented a clear, unshaken series of facts he had carefully gathered in secret. Archival records, photographs of the recovery center Griggs operated, signs of illegality in the transfer papers, and finally Tyson's medical file, listing injuries consistent with prolonged abuse, not training accidents. He doesn't need anyone to speak for him, Walter concluded, but if this court requires a statement, then let this be it. Tyson should never return to someone who shattered his trust in humanity. And now that he's learning to trust again, please don't break that. The courtroom fell into silence. And then, something no one expected. A young woman stood from the back row, petite, black hair, eyes locked forward with visible tension. Her name was called Megan Clark, former training assistant at Griggs's center. She had left after 1 year, officially due to personal stress. But today, she brought the truth. "I can't stay silent anymore," Megan said, her hands shaking but her eyes unwavering. "I saw how Griggs beat the dogs when they didn't respond correctly. They were kept in metal cages overnight. No bedding, no names, only numbers. Tyson was number 12. The room froze. Emily turned to Tyson. He hadn't moved, but his eyes fixed on Megan as if he recognized a voice long buried under silence. "After Officer Mark Forrester was killed," Megan continued, "Tyson panicked. He stopped eating and stopped responding. But instead of getting help, he was isolated, punished, to erase his memory," Griggs said. "I pleaded to have him transferred to a specialized care facility. Griggs refused. And when I left, Tyson was still there, until he vanished." Nothing more needed to be said. The judge, a silver-haired woman named Evelyn Moore, lowered her head to review the files again, then looked toward Tyson, sitting amid the people who weren't here to win, but simply to protect what mattered. And in that fleeting moment, Tyson glanced up at her. Not pleading, not afraid, but with a stillness that defied argument. It was not the gaze of property. It was the gaze of someone who had once been broken and now chose, wordlessly, to stand his ground. As Megan ended her testimony, her voice soft but resolute, the courtroom sank into a silence so deep that one could hear the ticking of the wall clock echoes like footsteps in a cave. At that moment, no one looked at Griggs as someone with authority. Whatever arrogance had once lingered along the bridge of his nose had long since vanished, erased the moment Tyson, without a bark, without protest, stood as living proof that loyalty could not be coerced or claimed. Judge Evelyn Moore, known for her strict rulings on property disputes, scanned the room one last time. She looked at Emily, hands clasped tightly to her chest. She looked at Jake, who watched Tyson with a readiness to block whatever harm might come. And then she looked at Tyson, still calm, unmoving, accepting of whatever decision came next, so long as it didn't cause more pain. She placed her hand on the stack of documents, inhaled deeply, and spoke. "After reviewing all documentation, testimonies, and evidence presented by all parties, I, under the law and my conscience, hereby reject Mr. Griggs's claim. The ownership documents lack legal standing and present signs of violation regarding animal welfare regulations." Her voice grew clearer, firmer. "Based on the facts brought forth today, I declare that Tyson is no longer under the ownership of any entity. He is an independent being, formerly in public service, abandoned and abused, now rehabilitated through evident care and deep emotional bonding with his current family." She turned to Emily with a small nod. If no appeal is filed within 10 days, Emily Carter and Jake Bennett are granted official custody of Tyson under the special K-9 retirement provision for service dogs without active placement. No one stood. No one spoke. The silence made space for one faint, nearly imperceptible sound, a long, quiet exhale from Tyson himself. Emily brought a hand to her face, not to cry, but to hold herself together in that surge of relief. Her shoulders shook as Jake placed a hand on her back. She only managed a few broken words. "He's not being taken anymore." Jake said nothing. He crouched slowly, rested a hand on Tyson's head. Not as a pat, but as a recognition. "You're one of us now, and no one's taking you away." Tyson lifted his head and licked Jake's wrist. Just once. A small gesture, yet one full of gratitude, peace, and promise no language could fully hold. In the back row, Leo gripped his mother's hand. He didn't speak. But when Emily glanced back, she saw him nod, his eyes clear as if recording something vital. Justice doesn't always shout, but it arrives if you don't give up. As everyone left the courtroom, Tyson did not rush. He walked slowly, carefully, each step deliberate and grounded, as if he understood he had just crossed not a courtroom, but an entire lifetime's worth of distance, not to be kept, but to be recognized. After the tense days of the hearing, after the final gavel struck to confirm something once unthinkable, that a dog once treated as property was now officially recognized as part of a family, the atmosphere in Emily and Jake's home grew lighter, even if no one spoke of it. There was no cheering, no big celebration, just a quiet, grateful stillness. And in that peace, Tyson began to learn how to live as a truly free being. That morning, sunlight poured into the backyard through a canopy of shimmering green leaves, casting a silky layer of light across the grass. The back door stood ajar, letting in the faint scent of wildflowers. No one woke Tyson. No one called his name. And yet, he stepped outside. Slowly, calmly, as if for the first time in his life, he hadn't been summoned by a whistle, a shout, or the stomp of boots on concrete. He lay down in that patch of sun. Not curled up as usual, not pressed to a wall like the old defensive instinct. He stretched out fully, legs extended, back turned to the door, head resting between his front paws, ears tilted just enough to catch the wind. The fur on his side was still patchy where the old scars lingered, but the light made it look soft again, as if those wounds had never existed. His eyes closed, not in caution, but in complete surrender. A few feet away, beneath the old oak tree where Jake had laid out a picnic mat, Leo sat cross-legged with a book in his lap. He wore a pale blue sweater, sleeves rolled up, fingers holding a worn comic, one Emily had once left on the shelf to simply fill the space. Until now, Leo had only stared at the pictures, redrawing characters with a pencil or filling them in with pastel chalk, never speaking aloud. But this morning, under a veil of soft sunlight and whispering leaves, Leo began to read. Slowly, quietly, but each word clear. His voice was uneven. Some words dropped. Some syllables vanished. But every word he spoke was aimed at one listener, or rather one soul resting beside him. Tyson. And the little fox crossed the big stream. He didn't know where his mother was, but he believed that if he kept walking, she would show up like before. Leo paused, bit his lip, then looked toward Tyson. He didn't say his name or reach out, but Tyson moved anyway. Just a small shift, a gentle stretch of a paw in Leo's direction. An answer without words. The boy lowered his eyes, then kept reading, not whispering anymore, but with a soft, determined voice, as though each syllable helped pull a piece of darkness out of himself. By the time the little fox found his mother at the end of the story, Leo closed the book, set it gently on his knees, and looked up at Tyson. For the first time, he spoke a sentence without printed letters to guide him. "You taught me to be brave, Tyson." Tyson didn't lift his head or shift again, but he exhaled. A deep, warm breath, not loud, but grounding, like a quiet affirmation. I know. Emily, watching from behind the kitchen window, witnessed the moment like a miracle. Not because a child had spoken, not because a once-abused dog could finally sleep in the sun, but because between two souls marked by wounds that had no names, something had grown. Silently, steadily, and so beautifully that it didn't need a name to be believed. And at that moment, Emily understood. Tyson's journey, from fear to peace, from a deleted name in a database to a name whispered by a child, was never just a story of a rescued dog. It was the story of a dog who chose to live on, and in doing so, showed others how to do the same. From that first morning, when Tyson stretched out in the sun and Leo read aloud for the first time, each day afterward unfolded with a very specific kind of peace. Not quiet, not idle, but peace with depth, where old wounds were allowed space to breathe, to heal, to be recognized as part of the past rather than shadows still stretching across the present. Every time Emily passed through the backyard, she'd find Tyson lying beside Leo, or sometimes at Jake's feet, eyes half shut as if listening to the world shift around him. But instead of simply letting Tyson rest, Jake, once a soldier himself, misjudged for wounds that couldn't be seen, began to form an idea. One late afternoon, when Walter came by for a visit, the two men sat on the porch, watching Tyson gently rest his head on Leo's lap. And almost in unison they said, "He doesn't need to start over, but he can help others do it." And so a small class was born, not with chalkboards, not with whistles, not with shouting, just a quiet space behind Walter's old veterinary clinic. Once a storage room, now cleared out, laid with soft mats and lit with warm yellow bulbs. There they brought in dogs returned by training centers, not for aggression, but for fear, broken trust, or the kind of silence no one knew how to reach. Tyson didn't have to relearn anything. He didn't need to demonstrate perfect obedience or follow orders. He only needed to be there. The first time a black hunting dog named Max was brought in, he growled, shivered, and let no one close. Walter stepped back. Jake crouched low. Emily stood still. But Tyson, without making a sound, walked in a wide arc, then sat just 2 paces from Max. No commands, no reactions. Tyson simply sat, calm, steady, and watching, and strangely, within minutes, Max stopped growling. His ears dropped, his back softened. And in the days that followed, it happened again and again. Each time a new dog arrived, bearing its scars, its fears, its fractured breathing, Tyson would appear. He didn't do anything. He didn't have to. Because just by existing, unhurried, unjudging, whole, he was the answer. Walter began calling him the honorary trainer. Not as a joke, but as recognition. Tyson never needed a certificate. But to the dogs who once trembled until they forgot how to stand, Tyson was the first proof that peace existed. One afternoon, Emily saw something she would never forget. Tyson lying next to a small abandoned mutt. They were curled so closely, like silent brothers. The smaller dog rested his head on Tyson's leg and fell asleep. For the first time in many nights, Tyson's eyes were half open. Not asleep, but calm, as though standing guard over someone else's dream. Jake said quietly, as they watched from the doorway, "He's doing something no one can teach. He's passing on the life he once had to fight for." Emily smiled. Not the smile of relief, but the kind you give when you realize something sacred has taken root. Because Tyson, once discarded, once howling in the night from memories too loud, was now the safe place for those whom no one dared to expect anything from. And he did it without applause, without titles, simply by staying. In the days after Tyson became the honorary trainer, the air around him grew gentler than ever before. No more wary glances from the newly arrived dogs, no more frantic breathing in the corners of the room. His presence, silent but steady, had sown a kind of wordless trust, a peace not born of commands, but of experience. And within that stillness, Tyson began to change too. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but little by little, like a door long rusted shut, quietly creaking open at the touch of morning light. That morning, the sun stretched evenly across the backyard. The breeze was soft, the sky a pure, endless blue. Emily placed her training notebook on the small wooden table by the porch, where she often sat to review lesson notes. But today, she didn't write a word. Instead, she stepped down, barefoot on the grass, and walked to the shaded patch in the middle of the yard, where Tyson lay on his side, head resting on his front paws, eyes half closed like the prelude to a nap. Emily didn't call him. She sat down, her body lowering gently to the ground, legs crossed, palms resting open on her knees, and she simply breathed, with the breeze, with the earth. No words, no coaxing. She waited. After a while, Tyson opened his eyes. He looked at her. Not with caution, not with hesitation, but with calm. And when Emily leaned slightly forward and spoke softly, as though to her own heart, "Come here," Tyson didn't rush. He stood up, stretched out his front legs, yawned, then walked over in slow, measured steps, not drawn by habit, not pulled by command. He stopped a hand's breadth from her, meeting her gaze as if to ask, "Is this real, or just another moment that might vanish?" But then, perhaps sensing that here, there were no orders, only an invitation born of true desire, Tyson took one step closer, and then another, and nestled his head gently into her lap. Not bowed in submission, not a quick nudge followed by retreat, but a full surrender, the kind where all the old armor is quietly set aside, making space for trust. Emily said nothing. She lifted a hand, slowly, into the thick fur behind his neck, and pressed her palm gently against his back. Her heart caught in her chest as she felt him exhale. Long, soft, and deep, the sound of a soul releasing everything for the very first time. Tyson nudged her shoulder with his nose. Not seeking, not testing, just affirming. "I've chosen love, and this time I don't have to fight for it." Emily shivered, not from the breeze but from the quiet unraveling of something inside her, the sensation of watching a broken wing take flight again, not with the same feathers, but with a new kind of faith. "You know," she whispered, cheek against his forehead, "we never forced you to stay, but you chose to, and today, you chose to be loved." Tyson didn't answer, but his breathing was even now, his chest warm against her hand, as still and calm as a lake untouched by wind. From the window, Leo watched in silence. He didn't call out. He didn't interrupt. He just rested a hand against the frame, watching them the way only someone who had once been afraid of love could truly understand. Witnessing the moment when someone is no longer afraid to be loved. That morning, beneath a quiet canopy of leaves, in sunlight that poured golden across the grass, Tyson received his first embrace. Not to save someone, not to prove anything, but simply because he knew he was worthy. That afternoon, the small park by the lakeside shimmered under the golden sun. The wind stirred the treetops, rustling like time itself, laughing softly. Unhurried, gentle. Families sprawled out on picnic blankets. Children ran barefoot between stone benches. And in a quiet corner near the edge of the forest, Tyson chased a yellow butterfly, tail swaying, legs bounding like the rolling waves of a childhood finally returned. Leo giggled, arms spread as if to take flight, feet barely touching the ground as he followed close behind. No one called Tyson's name. No one gave him directions. Yet he ran back again and again to Leo's side, as though that was the safest place he had ever known. On a long bench facing the open sky, Emily leaned her head against Jake's shoulder. She hadn't spoken in a while, only watched Tyson's movements, fluid, free, no longer shadowed by fear or the need to look over his shoulder. He ran because it made him happy, not to escape. He stopped because he wanted to, not because he was told. "Then," Emily whispered, so soft her voice seemed to melt into the breeze, "I still don't understand, Jake. Out of all the cars that day, On all the streets in the world. Why us? Why did he choose to jump into our car?" Jake didn't answer right away. He sat up slightly, leaning back, eyes still on Tyson, now holding a fallen leaf between his teeth, shaking it playfully, stealing glances at Leo as if daring him to chase. Beneath the frame of a dog once shivering from past wounds, now burned a quiet, radiant joy. Then Jake smiled. Not a wide grin, but the kind built slowly by sleepless nights listening to Tyson's breathing, by mornings watching him sleep beside Leo's door, by the silent walk into a courtroom as a wordless witness who would never be forgotten. "Because sometimes," Jake replied, "we don't choose the dog. The dog chooses us." Emily turned to him, eyes glistening, not from a sudden wave of emotion, but because the answer had struck a truth she had never spoken, that some bonds don't begin with a plan. They begin in an unexpected moment, when a skinny, broken dog leaps into a stranger's car not for a reason he can explain, but because his heart already knows. This is home. A soft breeze passed through. On the grass, Leo sat down. Tyson followed, and the two of them faced the lake, the late sun wrapping their backs in a honey-gold glow. Emily stood, walked over, knelt beside Tyson, and gently wrapped her arms around his neck. No more wary glances, no more tight, desperate breathing. Tyson leaned into her embrace, eyes closed, peaceful, whole, and complete. No longer lost, no longer a forgotten canine, but a member of a family, a soul who had been chosen. Leo looked up, placed his hand gently on Tyson's back, then turned to Emily. "Mom, he's never going to leave us again, right?" Emily tightened her embrace and nodded. "Number because he chose to stay? And this time, no one can take him away." As the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the horizon in orange and rose, Tyson lay in the grass with his family, no longer held by cages, haunted by nightmares, or bound by fear. All that remained was freedom, love, and the choice he had made on his own. Tyson didn't need a medal to be called a hero. All he ever needed was a home. And at last, he found it. Tyson didn't walk into the lives of Emily, Jake, and Leo as a dog in need of rescue. He arrived as a quiet test, to see whether trust, compassion, and patience could be strong enough to guide a lost soul back into the light. And it was his silent yet unwavering presence that healed not only his own heart, but also stirred something deeper in those around him, something beyond empathy, the choice to stay and walk alongside. Among all the unanswered questions life leaves behind, perhaps the most beautiful truth isn't found in explanations, but in how each soul finds another, just like Tyson found them. Have you ever felt like a dog chose you? Not because of who you are, but because your heart felt like home? Share your story in the comments so we can hold on to these quiet acts of kindness together. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video, share it with fellow animal lovers, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey. Because sometimes we don't choose the dog chooses us.